So this paper is going to take a sideways look at the issues of text and textuality by thinking about annotation. I suggest that by looking at the practice of annotation over time, when, what, by whom, how, and why, we can learn much about texts themselves. As we shall see, annotation plays a key role in the meaning of texts in ways that relate to their very form and indeed formation. Nowhere truer perhaps than for digital texts. So in particular, I'm going to look at the role of semantic annotation in a current project and consider the affordances of using semantic annotation for the future study of text. That's kind of the grand plan. Let's see how it goes. First of all, what do I mean by annotation anyway, and why is it important? According to the Oxford English Dictionary, this is text 1 on the handout, annotation is a note added to anything written by way of an explanation or comment. Or at an even more basic level, an annotation is a sign that we formulate, a sign that we leave, a sign that points to something, points to a meaning, points to another word, but also points to the pointer. We leave signs. I annotate. The agency in the word note is extraordinary. Those aren't my words, that clever formulation there. That's a description by Gardner Campbell at his keynote at the 2019 I Annotate conference. According to Campbell, note, the noun, is one of the earliest 2% of entries recorded in the OED, along with such words as fall, run, and water. Note, the verb, one of the earliest 3%, along with call, love, and put. To note is what it means to be human in a way. So where there have been texts, there have been annotations. And a particularly good example, I think, we find in Thucydides, and it involves a peculiarly fixed type of text, an inscription. This is text 2 on the handout. The Lacedaemonians remembered, among other things, how in past time he had presumed on his own authority to inscribe on the tripod at Delphi, which the Hellenes dedicated as the first fruits of the victory of the Persians, this elegiac couplet. Pausanias, captain of the Hellenes, having destroyed the Persian host, made this offering to Phoebus for a memorial. The Lacedaemonians had at once effaced the lines and inscribed on the tripod the names of the cities which took part in the overthrow of the barbarian and in the dedication of the offering. But still, this act of Pausanias gave offence at the time, and now that he had again fallen under suspicion, seemed to receive a new light from his present designs. So this is a striking example of annotation, I think. A particular kind of annotation. The Spartans erase, they write over an inscription dedicated to Pausanias, as they want to make more of an emphasis on the community involvement, all of the Greeks involved in the repulse of the Persians. At the same time, Thucydides' text preserves the original inscription, a source of continuing mistrust of Pausanias, that but still. So Thucydides' text has it both ways, to have the annotation and the original text. So through this double act of erasure and preservation, his text goes some way towards fulfilling its promise to be something useful for all time. Now, an even more complex example of the relationship between annotation and textuality, I think we can see in the Venetus A manuscript of Homer's Iliad. It's quite lengthy. I'm not going to read it out, you'd be glad to know. I just want to pick out a few things from it. Since it's a manuscript preserving an oral poem, I think it's useful to think with as we ponder our own medial change from print to digital. The annotation is about a gloss on the phrase, and the will of Zeus was being accomplished. That's line 5 of the Iliad. Now, this line acts as a springboard for a discussion of its potential background. And in fact, the scholiast traces a link all the way back to the Cypria, a poem of the epic cycle whose opening lines are preserved only here. And in the end, this link is rejected, but nevertheless, I think it's revealing of reading practices going on. So let's try to tease out some of these aspects. In part, this annotation gestures towards oral poetics, as poets in performance wove their songs out of traditional units of utterance from the lexical level to whole story patterns. So in the echo chamber of archaic Greek hexameter epic, phrases such as the Dios boule, the plan or will of Zeus, resonated powerfully with and accrued much of their meaning from their previous usages. Now, critical to these mechanics of resonance are the audience. The more familiar and experienced an audience, the more they would make the connections, or indeed hear dissonances, between different oral texts through these recurrent units of utterance. Now, Orwellists use the metaphor of hyperlinking to talk about this process of generating meaning, following the links, as it were, to other texts out there. Interestingly, yesterday, Nicola Reggiani discussed how the earliest philological studies at the Library of Alexandria resulted not so much in the production of critical editions, but in interactive and interacting texts that incorporated different points of view on them, precisely through the act of annotation. This process he described similarly as hypertext, that is to say, a text that contains links to other texts. And I think here we see in Avanitis A manuscript a case of hypertexting, as the annotation links Homer's Iliad to the background story of the overpopulation of the earth cited in the Cyprius poem. This is an important point and shows the role annotation can play in a text reception, I think. But there's also a critical difference from the hyperlinking of oral poetics. And this relates to the form and the purpose of the annotation. The manuscript annotation is for a literary audience of Homer. That is to say, one coming to Homer's poems only through this written artifact. Excluded from the original performance context of the poems, and with no exposure to the practice of listening to epic, the reader of Homer lacks the means to reconstitute the oral poetics on which they are based. The words on the page hold few, if any, prior associations for such a reader. The reader needs support. Hence this annotation, the diospule. But this referentiality is necessarily limited and limiting. It provides only a single example from a vast and ever-evolving tradition of poetry and performance. It's an example, furthermore, that survives only because of Homer's poem. And I think that comes across nicely when you look at the manuscript itself. So the main text there in bold, that's Homer's Iliad, and the rest of it are these marginal glosses, mainly this one I've been talking about. So we look at the form of the annotation here, and it's preserved in the margins of the Homeric text, which is front and center and bold. The annotation can be read only one way, to serve as a reading of the Iliad. The resonance of the Cyprius tale are irrevocably lost here. Having said that, of course, it's also important to note how the annotation does give a sense of the importance of the broader epic context in and against which to read the Iliad. Indeed, it's one that also draws out post-Homeric cultural frames, really important for thinking of the kind of the reception of Homer. So the mention of Momus, for example, or Greeks and barbarians, Near Eastern motifs of the flood, really thinking about the kind of the reception of Homer's Iliad in these later reading communities. And that's really as a result of the technology of the book. So the book here as a context for reading the Homeric text and its reception. And that's why I think it's thinking of the technology of the book, I think is really important for thinking about where we are now with the new digital medium. But there's one final point I want to make before moving on to my main focus, which is about digital annotation. And that's trying to bring out something from Caroline Levine's recent analysis of form. This is text 3 on the handout. I think Levine is particularly good at bringing out the persistence of forms. For example, aspects of the medieval monastery preserved in university structures, or how a computer is based on previous technologies, and even the language that we use, such as tablet or scrolling. Now that's important for how we think of a text, I think, even one in a digital form. And after all, by far the most common form of text on the web at the minute is the PDF book, for good or for ill. But Levine's analysis also, I think, draws insight into the communities of practice that emerge from these forms, transcribing the text in monasteries from generation to generation, now being represented in a way at the heart of philological scholarship in universities, perhaps even the same religious devotion to text and philology. So the question I think that I want to pose is, what communities of practice are forming in the digital medium? I think thinking about communities of practice is just as important as thinking about text and annotation. Anyway, the rest of this presentation is going to be about text, digital text and digital annotation. So the affordances of the digital medium, I think, may be considered largely in terms of annotation, where annotated copies of books tended to be discouraged, by librarians at least. Online content can be greatly enriched by the medium. On text 4 of the handout, I give various examples here of digital methods and standards, specifically about the use of metadata. Here we might think of TEI, Text Encoding Initiative, digital editions based on TEI texts, and here there's an example of the work at Leipzig. Digital platforms displaying these texts and the metadata, and here not only Perseus, but the new Perseus platform, the Scaife Digital Library, scaife.perseus.org. One thing they all have in common are they all make use of annotation, and they change the way that text can be thought of and used, I think. There are also tools for doing annotation. One of the primary ones being used in pedagogy at the minute is one called Hypothesis.is. I'll discuss another one in a moment. As for scholarly uses of digital annotation, I'll give a few random examples. This first one is one I've been working on myself. It's from the Hestia project, where we used annotation of places and peoples in book 5 of Herodotus to bring out some underlying spatial relationships, structuring the narrative. Another one we might point to Jenny Strauss-Clay's team use of digital annotation at Iliad's catalogue of ships, which has facilitated identifying patterns in Homer's itinerary. Notably, and here I just draw attention to this upper patterning here, the absent presence of Thebes. Thebes not actually mentioned, but when you map or annotate and then map all the places in the text, you see how they circle around Thebes. That's particularly important, I think, for thinking about the dynamics of Homeric epic, the present absence of Thebes. And Bruno Latour, we might think typically challenging the very notion of the scholarly monograph, has worked to reframe the book by making it a collaborative enterprise, implementing by, yes, you've guessed it, using annotation. His online platform boasts 206 contributions from over 60 contributors. Now, I think the benefits of the uses of annotation are clear here. They enable different ways into the text, particularly that idea of spatial patterning, as well as allowing greater transparency and, I think, accountability, very important points. Nevertheless, there are downsides, the issue of sustainability, as tech moves on or money runs out. And I give, this is unfair on Bruno, but there's, I just noticed that on his webpage, the tutorial now doesn't work, the video tutorial. This is a project from 3 or 4 years ago, so perhaps no surprise. But I think another critical downside is the lack of transferability. And that's what I really want to focus on here, or rather the problem of transferability. Text and annotations online assume different forms, and this hinders the interoperability between different resources. So in fact, proliferating data standards are one of the critical problems in digital humanities work. The difficulty of crosswalking between different tools, moving between different data sets. That's why we talk about data silos, for example. Everyone's database just up on the web, not linked in any way. In this relative absence of established practices, the World Wide Web is more like the World Wide West. So in my remaining time, I want to focus on a particular form of markup known as semantic annotation, which can help to address some of these issues. Now, semantic annotation, this is text 5 on the handout, is defined as the process of tagging documents with relevant concepts, or more fully, building upon the traditional idea of annotation, semantic annotation encodes a link between, 1, a reference within an information carrying resource, an online document, such as a record in a numismatics database, for example, or a toponym in a text, and this is known as the target, and 2, entities defined by uniform resource identifier, or URI, in an authority file, typically a list of notable individuals in a prosopography or places in a geographic gazetteer. And these are known as the body. Now, why is semantic annotation important? Or perhaps to phrase that differently, how is it different from ordinary annotation? This goes back to that question of community of practice, I think. In contrast to the print medium, the digital realm is still developing a sufficiently robust infrastructure and an established practice of conducting scholarship. That is to say, it lacks a widely disseminated, easy to follow set of standards, protocols, and methods. Let us consider, for example, the idea of linking data online. Now, linking, of course, is the fundamental property of the web. It's what we do all the time when we're on the web. We're continually following links. But this potential is far from realized. The term linked data, and who better to turn to than Tim Berners-Lee, is about making links so that a person or machine can explore the web of data. With linked data, when you have some of it, you can find other related data, stuff that you haven't produced yourself and you haven't produced the links for. Important here is the idea of structured data, which in turn, I think, relates to a set of best practices, that social dimension again. And this is where semantic annotation comes in. By using semantic annotation, it's possible to connect stuff on the web that is somehow related to each other through some concept, a person, event, or place, for example. And it's the concept of place that I want to explore further as I come to draw this talk to a close. So this is a slide about the URI and a particular form of URI, looking at the Pleiades online gazetteer for the classical world. So the online, the URL there contains the URI, this disambiguating code number for the description of classical Athens. Now, Pelagios uses semantic annotation, the disambiguation and identification of places in documents, as a means of linking those documents. And by documents, I mean here not only text, but also other kinds of objects, such as maps, images, or databases. The semantic part of this geo-annotation uses place URIs from an authority gazetteer, such as Pleiades, which I've just shown you. And to enable work in this area, Pelagios has developed the semantic annotation tool, Recogito. This is the slide that you're looking at the minute. Now, any fool can use this. Trust me, I can use it, so any fool can. And you can do much more than just semantic annotation. It's the semantic annotation part that I want to focus on briefly. So to end, I'm going to use a few slides relating to a current project, the Digital Periegesis project, that's mapping Pausanias' description of Greece, to give a sense of what semantic annotation looks like and some of its affordances. So first, the burning question I'm sure you have is, how do you do semantic annotation in a platform like Recogito? Well, it's really dead simple. You highlight a character string. This is the first step. A pop-up box comes up. This character string you are asserting is a place. A pop-up box comes up asking you, well, what place is it? What Athens do you mean, for example? Athens of REM or Athens of classical Athens, and you use that pop-up box to link the particular place reference in the document to this authority file in a gazetteer. So it's a two-step process. Now, by doing that, you can then map a place. So that's already one kind of big win, is once you've semantically annotated the place references, you can then map them and do further exploration. But you can do other stuff too in Recogito. And here, I just want to draw attention to not only the entity itself, place, but the use of tags to be able to better define a place. And here you can use, for example, the language of the author or particular concepts that you're interested in order to structure the place information that you're generating. And that information might have to do with whether a particular place is part of the built environment, it's a regional concept, it's maybe a natural feature, etc. And here's just another example, the sense of, particularly in Pausanias, where you have an itinerary, we're using the tag Pausanias to identify when Pausanias is there on the ground, describing to his reader a particular place that he sees. So there are various ways in which Pausanias talks about place. This is one of them, probably I would say the main way in which he guides you through the text, through this ground up view, this itinerary. Now, using tags to provide a topology is basically making a database out of the text. And from that, we'll be able to map and analyze all references, for example, to a particular place, Thermopylae, for example, or all temples to Zeus, or particular statues, statues to gods, statues to Zeus, statues that are human, whether they're made out of bronze, whether they're wooden. So all of these different aspects that we're creating through this process of semantic annotation and tagging. And I say we can then make use of this, but the data that we're producing is going to be open, so other people can also make use of the annotations that we're doing. But equally importantly, I think, semantic annotation does something else. And I just want to dwell very, very briefly on this slide just for 1 minute. And that's that first annotation I showed you before, the enther. Well, first of all, note how difficult this would be for a computer to be able to identify this as a place, because it's not a place name, it's not a toponym. So this requires a human being able to make an identification and not only assert that it's a place, but it's a particular kind of place. But actually, as I was reading through the text and going through making these semantic annotations, I noted an interesting slippage between the first reference to Laurion and then this enther, which picks up the reference to Laurion. When I read Laurion, first of all, I instantly thought of silver mines, because that's what I'm trained to do, being a good Herodotean scholar. Silver mines are a big thing. But then we have this follow-up clause that Pausanias gives us, where at one time the Athenians had silver mines. So that got me through this very kind of process of slow reading. It got me to reassess my previous annotation and think maybe the reference there to Larion isn't so much the silver mines themselves as to Larion as an area, as a deme of Athens. Now, this is just one example, and I can multiply it, trust me, to a great length. This is just to bring out the idea that going through this process of essentially thinking like a computer slows your reading down. And I think this is an important point to make, because when people talk about digital humanities, it tends to be all about big data, distant reading. But I would emphasize that semantic annotation, at least through a platform like Recogita, which really brings you up close and dirty to the text, slows your reading. It continually tests or gets you to test your preconceptions and your logic. So in fact, each annotation is essentially an interpretation as well. Now, of course, we shouldn't lose sight of the new ways of contextualizing the text. And here I'll show you a prototype of what a linked data search might look like. I think it's particularly invaluable for an author like Pausanias, where because he's describing places and objects in space, we can follow many links to databases of the cultural information he describes, maps about those places and archaeological site reports. But I would say it's equally applicable to any historical resource. What we have here is the possibility of discovery of resources, to provide greater context for your own resources, and reuse of other people's resources, and of course, enabling your resources to be reused as well. And I'll give you the example of Rome here, just to make a cheap pun. The resources that I've highlighted here relate to inscriptions, texts, coins, buildings, the whole gamut of what it means to study the ancient world, all connected now through linkages through place references. So what I would say is, with this idea of following up the links might remind us of the lost world of oral epic, where audiences contributed meaning to resonant phrases depending on their experience and expertise. But potentially, now what we're talking about now is far more information, greater transparency, more possibilities of deriving meaning. On the other hand, while computers can do much of the heavy lifting, including surfacing links like this, it's humans who are going to be left doing the interpreting. And so it's the human aspect that I want to end with this last slide. So my end note is, whatever the future of the text is, I would say that there's a role for social annotation. Pelagios, as James mentioned in my opening spiel, is now a formal network of equal and interdependent partners, sharing knowledge and expertise, coordinating activities together, planning and implementing development. Just as the manuscript technology provided affordances for annotation to enrich texts, so too the digital revolution, which we're currently experiencing in our everyday lives, and research, has the potential to radically transform texts and their textuality through the process of semantic annotation. Into what forms and for what end, that's down to us. Thanks for your attention. And